Arirang Special.
Korea division was a product of the Cold War, but it has become internalized since then.
It's a huge win for the United States and the international community if Korea is unified.
Focusing solely on the denuclearization has not worked.
There could be some sort of major political event in the country, in the next 5 years or so.
Let's now move on from why unification is necessary to how exactly it can be attained. To do so, we should first turn our attention to Germany. November 9, 1989, is when the sudden fall of the Berlin Wall shocked everyone around the world. But the unification of Germany is not a miracle that happened overnight. The question is, can Korea also achieve peaceful unification as Germany did?
November 9, 2014 marked the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that divided Germany's east and west. A lot of Germans still visit the site that once symbolized the Cold War and relive the joy from that day. Kurt L. Hermandum, who once lived in West Berlin, still cannot forget how the Berlin Wall came down almost overnight.
As Germans, it was a great chance that this happened, and 25 years ago now. And I think on both sides of Germany we feel very, very happy about it.
The West-East divide began in 1945 as Germany surrendered to the Allies. As the division set in, more and more people began to cross over from East Germany to the West.
They had to close the border because the people were running away. And after the border was closed, you had many, many people who were dissatisfied with the situation economically, politically, and culturally. The motivations for them to leave the country, to risk their life, was they wanted more prosperity and they wanted to be free, to live the life as they choose how they want to live it.
As their last resort, the East German government put in place a 45.1-kilometer concrete wall dividing Berlin. And this became the Berlin Wall.
Having this wall around it, so in West Berlin there was a Berlin Wall all around West Berlin, and it was kind of like an island in East Germany, and all this completely changed in one night, nearly, literally. Yeah.
The Berlin Wall, that for a long time was seen as a symbol of the Cold War, fell on November 9, 1989.
The moment itself was very moving for us. We are all on the streets for the first 3 days and nights. I think I slept 2 hours or so. We were partying with people from East Berlin, and we were walking to the wall, trying to tear it down with hammers and working on it. It was very moving.
But in many ways, the wall was already destined to be torn down. The people of East Germany had already begun a movement of resistance, dreaming of freedom. On October 9th, at a prayer meeting at an East German church, some 70,000 people gathered to take part in the so-called Monday demonstrations. A week later, this number had grown to 120,000. Under the slogan, "We are the people," they took to the streets with candles shouting for democracy. What led up to these changes was Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet leader who came into power in 1985 and shook up the paradigm in international politics. Gorbachev carried out top-down reforms known as perestroika, or restructuring, and glasnost, which called for increased openness. On the heels of movements of reform within the Soviet Union and the East Bloc, along with calls for democracy within East Germany, on October 3, 1990, Germany was finally able to reunify.
It was time of perestroika, when the political confrontations between Russia and Germany, in two German states, between Russia and European countries, between Russia and the United States, were at a very high level. It was easy to minimize any negative trends in these processes and to support positive trends in this unification.
Other countries that had been split since the Cold War, such as Vietnam, Yemen, and Germany, all saw unification in the 20th century, making Korea the only divided country in the world. Unlike the unification of Yemen or Vietnam, which were realized through force, Germany's unification was relatively peaceful and seen as successful.
Case of Yemen, for example, was one in which you had a fairly good integration process. I mean, the country has deteriorated since then, but a very phased integration process. Relatively speaking, Germany was more sudden, and that is a process that has taken decades, but at the same time it was an absorption case, which would probably be something close to what the Korean case would look like. And Vietnam, of course, was different in something I think that we don't want to see, which was unification by war. It was the result of the end of a war. And so, you know, of the ones that might most closely resemble Korea, it would probably be some combination of Yemen and Germany.
The question is, can the two Koreas achieve unification similar to that of Germany's? The conditions surrounding the Korean Peninsula and Germany at the time look rather different.
In case of German unification, I think Gorbachev's new initiatives, both domestically and externally, I think were very important background factors. He wanted to kind of sort of introduce and reform both domestically and externally, and that led to the breakdown of the Berlin walls. And so change in superstructure, so to speak. I mean, international politics or international structure of geopolitics changed first, which led to the collapse of East Germany, and which led to the unification of Germany. And for North Korean case, I don't think there is any superstructure. North Korea is an independent authoritarian system.
Korea division was a product of the Cold War, but it has become internalized since then. So even though the Cold War ended 25 years ago, Korean division continues because it isn't dependent on the Cold War structure. Europe is different. Divided Germany was completely embedded in the Cold War system. And therefore, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended, Germany was unified. But in Korea, this has become much more of an internal conflict between North and South Korea, to which the external countries all have some kind of interest.
The internal factors differ in Korea's division, with an anomalous dictatorship ruling North Korea, and the external political currents have also changed from the time of Germany's unification. On top of that, the lack of exchange and communication between the South and North, in stark contrast to the case of East and West Germany, is cited as a weakness.
You had a war, you had a civil war in the 50s, in the early 50s, and I think the situation afterwards is followed this confrontation in the early 50s. In Germany, we didn't have a war, and that means the exchange between West and East and West was much, much stronger through all the time till '89 than it is in your country. We had the border closed, and the border in Germany looked like the border in Korea when you saw it, but in reality people could cross the border from west to east, and millions did it throughout the time. So the communication between the both populations was very strong, and East Germans had the opportunity to watch West German TV, to listen to West German radio, and so they had a window to the world through the West media. And that means their orientation towards Western countries, towards Western lifestyle was very strong, and through all the time they wished that they could cross the border, that they could visit.
Considering the differences between Korea and Germany, what then would be the most ideal model for the country's unification?
Of course, the ideal model is soft landing, where North Korea transforms itself, develops economically, pursue China's economic model, and which leads to two Koreas unifying in a peaceful manner. That is the most ideal scenario.
As for neighbor country, we believe that the best way would be gradual unification, and economic stage must be the first stage of the cooperation and integration of two countries, and it let it possible to decrease political tension on the peninsula, and to realize some economic projects with cooperation with other countries. And I think that in general it will be possible to decrease political insecurity and tension, and after that to find out ways to realize some common programs in social sphere and political sphere and security sphere.
Remember, Germany, it happened just with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And in the North Korean case, ideally it would be something where there's a great degree of integration and interaction between the two Koreas, and ability for North Koreans to start to see the outside world, to become more acclimated to South Korea, political relations between the two countries, and a long process.
To sum it all up, the ideal model for Korea's unification would be based on a peaceful, gradual, and well-prepared process. But in reality, realizing this idea does not look easy. This is because the two Koreas differ greatly on how unification should be carried out. In the South, a one-state, one-government model under a unified constitution and parliament is considered ideal, whereas in the North, the method pursued is a federal state. In other words, one state with two governments.
You raised one format of unification, and they raised the other. They said, we should insist on the federation format or confederation format. I don't think your side will agree with that. I don't think your side will accept that. And by the same token, they won't accept the format you raised or you offered. So that's the situation. That's the answer. Says, in principle, yes, both sides insist on the unification. No difference, no question. But in terms of the approach, format, structures, and so many things, lot of differences that, on one hand, impede the process of unification. On the other hand, input a lot of uncertainties on the unification process.
But the North Korean regime has lasted for now 25 years after East Germany collapsed, and they are still very tenacious, very stubborn. So I would like to think that Koreans will come up with their own style of unification that will be totally different from anything we've seen before.
It looks like there is a need to create a unification model unique to Korea. The key is how to overcome different thoughts that have been running parallel ever since the two sides were separated.
If the so-called best unification for both of the sides is sharply different, then we need to seek for the so-called secondary best for both of sides. Because in reality, the so-called best unification can only serve for one side and sacrifice the other sides.
The South should be responsive and attentive to any signals from the North that they do want to engage and take these opportunities to move forward on high-level contacts, economic ties, trade ties, investment. And I think most importantly over the long run, people-to-people contacts. I think one of the most important aspects of the decade of engagement from 1998 to 2008 was the large number of South Korean ordinary people, tourists, businessmen, journalists who visited the North. And some North Koreans came to the South as well. But I think that kind of exposure of ordinary people on both sides will go a long way toward dispelling a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings and lead toward a more peaceful and harmonious unity of the two sides.
In order to realize peaceful unification on the peninsula, it's not only the two Koreas that need to work together, but cooperation from neighboring countries that will be crucial. In the case of Germany, the 2+4 treaty involving cooperation between East and West Germany, the US, the Soviet, France, and the United Kingdom played a significant role. Even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, up until unification between the two sides, negotiations with other countries had to take place.
When we came into the situation that the East German people elected in 1990, elected the parties who were standing for a strong and fast reunification. The international situation had to be cleared. And in 1989, still some of the regulations of 1945 were in power. So you had the four allies of 1945 who had decided about Germany as a whole, and you had to bring them on one table together to solve the problems. Putting both sides together, you needed the Soviet Union, United States, Great Britain, and France. The German government at that time decided that they asked for the four allies from 1945 to come together with both German states and establish a contract that is like a peace contract, because we had no peace contract in Germany since 1945. Same situation as in your country. So then the 4+2 negotiations were the negotiations to have in the end peace contract for whole Germany with all the four allies, and that meant from that point on Germany was a sovereign state. Before it wasn't.
For Korea's unification and what will unfold after it, the role of other countries like the US, China, Japan, and Russia will be important. What role will these countries need to play?
Well, so first of all, I think it's extremely important for the United States to even state that unification of the two Koreas is its long-term policy, and it's a goal, and it's a vision that everyone is striving for. We don't even have that as stated, and not even stated or unstated. We don't have that, and I think it's extremely important to set that as a goal.
As one of the major external powers, China should try all efforts to encourage and facilitate the inter-Korean dialogues on all dimensions. Not necessarily only encourage dialogues purely for the unification, but dialogues on increasing engagement between the two Koreas and reduction of tensions, increasing exchanges between the two, and so on. So the more dialogues, the more contacts, the more engagement between the two Koreas, the better conditions for unification dialogues or negotiations. So that's one role China should play.
Also, each country can aid in areas of reducing military threats in the process of unification, sharing the burden of cost involved and assisting North Korean people.
And I think the United States' role would be to support. I think the U.S. would have a paramount interest in ensuring that the military weapons are all secured. So I'm sure that would be a major concern. In terms of domestic stabilization and humanitarian relief, South Korea would be in the lead, but I think the United States would want to help and support, would want to use its influence to get international institutions to help as well. So I think that would largely be the role for the United States, would be to be a supportive role.
In the Pyongyang Declaration of 2002, there is an agreement. There are items relating to Japanese apologies of the past, colonization, as well as the form of de facto compensation, for the loss and damage done by colonization. Those things are already there in the Pyongyang Declaration. So I think which is also an indication that Japan doing something as to the northern part of the Korean Peninsula is still unresolved.
Russia can positively affect on it. We can support development of the North Korea by investment in modernization of electric power stations, in modernization in railway systems. We can support North Korea by construction, when we construct pipelines to South Korea and gas pipelines, oil pipelines, electricity network. If inter-Korea relations will be improved, then it will be possible for Russia to realize some significant projects on the Korea Peninsula.
North Korea's longtime ally China, believed to have great influence over the country, is expected to play a significant role in the process of unification.
China will be an important partner for the situation if it comes nearer or closer to a question of reunification, because as long as China doesn't agree, I think it will not happen.
But I think that China is perhaps the more interested partner, because China has a long border and they don't have any interest that at that border something explodes. They have a Korean minority. It's their steel belt in a region in these 4 provinces north of North Korea. It's a delicate, important industrial region, and that's why I think they could be good partners.
More recently, South Korea has been enjoying budding relations with China, a former enemy state during the Korean War. In contrast, conventional ties between Pyongyang and Beijing no longer look as strong as they used to.
I think we have less political influence on North Korea than in South Korea, because we have a larger trade with South Korea, and where they have a military relationship with South Korea, and where we have national leaders talk to each other many times a year. But Chinese government have no chance to talk with North Korea's leaders, and we don't have any military-to-military relations.
The changing relations between China and North Korea and China and the South began in 1992, when Seoul and Beijing restored diplomatic relations, putting the past behind them.
since the normalization with South Korea, that trigger, the normalization with South Korea triggered our adjustment, say adjusting our allied-based relationship with North towards a normal-based friendship. And by the same token, adjusting the enemy-based relationship with the South towards the normal friendship either. So we adjusted both of the relationship from the two ends towards the same tide.
More people are now emphasizing the importance of using these ties to draw out closer cooperation between Seoul and Beijing for unification, and that multilateral collaboration has become imperative.
It is on the low level, and that's why it's necessary to upgrade international consultations and cooperation in order to minimize negative trends during possible Korean unification and support positive trends in Korean unification.
For trade, for political support, for security. I think that a Helsinki-style multilateral engagement of North Korea gives North Korea choices. They can work with different countries to advance their economy, to improve their human rights record, to improve their security. And they don't need to feel that they are making themselves completely dependent on China or giving in to American pressure. And the presence of smaller countries like Mongolia or Vietnam in this process can be very reassuring to the North, because those countries offer up models of economic development and models of political development that North Korea might borrow ideas from. So I think a multilateral process makes sense. It helps to ensure that the big powers won't try to take advantage of the process. And it gives some reassurance to the North that they can participate in this engagement without losing their sovereignty.
This year, Germany celebrates its 25th anniversary of the unification. During that time, the unified Germany has become the fourth largest economy and a central power of the European Union. However, those living in what used to be East Germany still face a national income that's at 70% of their counterpart in the West. The unemployment rate is double, and the gap between the East and the West still exists, along with cultural differences. True unification between the two is still a work in progress. Through the experience of Germany, there are lessons to be learned, not only on how to attain unification, but also what problems may arise after achieving it.
When thinking of post-unification, the issue that's most frequently brought up is the question of how to overcome the difference between the people of the South and the North, who have been separated for such a long period of time. In the case of Germany, it has been more than 25 years now since unification, but the difference between people from East and West Germany is still noticeable.
When you asked the Western Germans what is more important, freedom or equality, so the majority pointed out that freedom is for them most important. On the Eastern side, equality is the most important thing they complain, and it still is.
Well, here I think the German example does provide some lessons, because even if you achieve the integration of the institutions, you know, whether it's the economic institutions or the military institutions or, you know, the postal service, whatever it is, energy infrastructure grids, even if you achieve those sorts of material, that sort of material unification, the hardest part of unification is really the mental and emotional part.
Mental and emotional differences that are not overcome will lead to discrimination and inequality, causing distress within society that will lead to extra costs.
For instance, and because of different education, and then if the two Koreas united as one. How do you treat the people the other side? Do they get the same opportunity to get the same job with the same salary? You can hardly make it. If it won't happen, the people from the north will be unhappy with that. They think they are discriminated. So the discrimination will become a big social problem. It will cause a lot of riots.
But the fact that North Koreans and South Koreans have been separated for over 6 decades, and North Korea grew up completely indoctrinated under Juche philosophy, I'm very much concerned about how they can truly merge as two societies, particularly the middle-class North Koreans. How will they find themselves? The North Korean doctors will say, okay, this medicine, what I know is so average or mediocre or now no longer relevant. Engineers, same thing. Particularly the middle class, I think, will be really displaced in South Korean society. And the teachers, history teachers, social science teachers, and what do they really know about the Korean history or the world's history? They might know where Kim Jong-il was born in Baekdu Mountain and some crazy fable, but they don't know the true story.
That is why what's most necessary after unification is an understanding of mutual differences stemming from long periods of living under separate systems and cultures. Acknowledgement, acceptance, and patience will all be crucial.
And so I think that'll be the hardest part of unification, and it will take a lot of hard work on the part of the North Koreans to achieve more, being given new opportunities. And it will take a great deal of effort on the South Korean side not to be prejudicial, not to look down, to be magnanimous and welcoming of these new members of society.
Most likely, a unified Korea will be dominated by the South. After all, the South is wealthier, it has twice the population. But that doesn't mean that the South can simply impose its system on the North. Even if the North Koreans might prefer to be under the South Korean system, they have lived under a very different one. So they need to have their voices heard. And so in addition to the political unification, the economic integration, this cultural and social integration will be a very difficult task which people must put a lot of resources and attention to.
This is why, ahead of unification, a lot of preparation and practice should take place with the aid of North Korean defectors and their community.
I think we can start by doing more with the defector community, because that's a perfect example of how we can deal with once there are two Koreas to unify. I know that North Korean defector community has a lot of difficulty. Some of them are very successful, but there's some of the defectors are very stigmatized or unhappy. Some of them even wanted to go back to North Korea. So I think currently maybe the government can work with the defector community to better their lives and see what we can do, because they're a perfect model for what we would have to deal with once two Koreas unify.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall, for a long time Germany experienced the after effects of unification. Without much preparation for it, the industries collapsed in East Germany and the unemployment rate skyrocketed. Germany's economy, once dubbed the engine of Europe, began to backpedal. This is why the issue of South Korea's economy backtracking under the economic burden of unification is considered a big problem.
If this situation comes, the people in North Korea will not wait till prosperity comes to North Korea. They will all try to come to South Korea. And in Germany, we had 17 million East Germans and 60 million West Germans. But even in 1989 and 1990, 1 million East Germans went to West Germany. So they didn't want to wait. The young people didn't want to wait. And at that time, all the economical experts said, we cannot give them the German mark. But the people said, when we don't get the German mark, then we come to West Germany where the German mark exists. So our government had to decide to give them the German mark much, much earlier as they wanted.
I think Koreans should learn from the lesson of Germany, which tried to equalize the economic status of East and West very quickly, exchanging the East German currency for the West German one-on-one. That was, I think, many Germans now say was a mistake. But the gap between North and South Korea is much greater than it was between East and West Germany in 1989.
In the case of Germany, it resolved these economic problems with the opening of its labor market.
The most important success of Germany was that unification enforced an opening of labor markets in West Germany because of the pressure from East Germans that looked for work. That in fact implied that many East Germans started to work in West Germany, produced goods there, and the financing of part of unification was simply done from taxes that were generated by additional national wealth produced by East Germans in West Germany.
Also, by using the eastern area as the center of industrial development, it was able to become an important driving force for the revival of the country's economy. Heading into the 21st century, Germany boasted a $40,000 GNI per capita with a population of 80 million, sputtering back to life as a 40-80 club country.
We, for instance, in 1988, before unification, we shipped the whole motor engine production plant from West Germany to East Germany, and they produced half of the engines for the West German cars. That was the small Polo from VW, and the others were produced for the East German market. So this is the type of investment that is long-term and stabilizing the economic structure.
Ahead of unification in Korea, reducing the gap between the economies in the South and North by improving the North's economy can also be a means of preparation. Seoul's Unification Preparatory Committee has laid out a three-step process for economic unification involving the formation, maturing, and establishment of trust. This is why projects such as building homes to improve social infrastructure in the North and economic cooperation are being planned.
If it's more gradual, then hopefully North Korea would be able to build up its economy more. But even were to do that, the gap will be substantial. So there has to be not just South Korean resources, but hopefully the international community as a whole, including Korea's neighbors, including the United States, will devote a lot of resources into rebuilding North Korea, into rehabilitating the North Korean economy, and bringing the North eventually up to a level compatible with the South. It will not be easy. It will take some time, but it can be done. And people, again, should be preparing now to think about how that can best be achieved.
Investing in North Korea is important, in my opinion, because the more you invest, the more the wealth goes up, the less the difference to South Korea, the easier is to bridge this gap in a unification process. However, the economic zones that you presently have are mostly zones that are low technology, which implies with unification they will collapse, because that's a technology that you might have in Vietnam or in parts of Malaysia and so on, but no longer in India, no longer in China, and no longer in Korea. The experience from Germany tells us that investors think not about present wage levels, but future wage levels. And this means that the present situation with the economic zones, like the Kaesong zone, are not a good preparation for unification. They are nice to produce cash. They are nice to enable South Korea to produce goods that it would otherwise have to produce in Vietnam or I don't know where. But it's not a long-term guarantee for North Korean economic stabilization.
After unification, there was another problem Germany had to tackle. It was about holding those accountable for violence and oppression near the Berlin Wall and border areas, as well as the invasion of privacy by secret police during the era of separation.
I couldn't bear the idea of having to live the rest of my life in this country that has been separated by a wall. At the time, no one imagined that the wall would fall or two Germanys would unify.
Only the higher functionaries were brought into a court, and they were prosecuted because of the victims on the border. They were the people who were responsible for the border regime. Many people died on the border when they tried to leave the country, so they were prosecuted and they got sentences between 4 and 6 years. So that victims at that time said that's not enough. It was hard to accept for people when you think people who lost the leg when they tried to cross the country because they were mines, and then after the reunification, the people who are responsible for the regime on the border and who were responsible for the mines, most of them got 1 year or not even had to go into prison. So the victims weren't dissatisfied with that.
It was messy in Germany. Germany's secret police had tortured and violated the human rights and violated the privacy rights of the East German people for decades. And very few of them were ever held criminally responsible for their actions. But that was the choice of the German people. The Korean people might make a different choice.
An issue that Korea must also face after unification is serving justice. In other words, it's the question of how to hold people accountable for human rights abuses and various other crimes within the North.
We will have to follow the legal process. I'm not a lawyer, so I think it'll be very difficult when we get down to legal proceedings to find the evidence, because right now even what we have is a lot of defector testimonies. But I think in this case, German, the Nazi years would be a perfect example, and we probably have to get a lot of specialists and the lawyers, international law, criminal lawyers, to involve and sort of, move forward from whatever we have learned from the Nazi era, because I think there's a very similar case.
But the form of justice is going to have to be decided by the Korean people. It might take the form of some sort of a tribunal, like we had in Cambodia, where leaders of the Khmer Rouge regime were arrested and convicted of crimes. But it might take the form of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like you had in South Africa, a non-judicial reconciliation process that tried to seek the truth and tell the truth, but not to hold people criminally responsible for crimes that they may have committed. It will be up to the Korean people to decide, but some form of truth-telling and accountability, I think, will be essential.
The largest task at hand for the Korean Peninsula may be unification, but what's more important is achieving true integration after the two sides are unified. The road towards overcoming differences and realizing mental and emotional unity, the road towards establishing a healthy economy on both sides, and the road towards serving justice. The journey down these roads may be much longer than the road towards unification.
At least a generation, maybe 2 or 3 generations will be required before there is that kind of integration. But I studied Korean history. Korea was unified for 1,300 years before division. So I think if it takes 50 years, 100 years for integration, that's not a long time over the long history of Korean unity.
After all is done and achieved, imagine a time in the future when the country is one. What will a unified Korea look like? According to studies, overall growth is expected on the peninsula. The population will reach 70 to 80 million, and the South's technology combined with the North's resources is expected to spur economic growth at over 10% a year. The North will experience a rapid increase in its GDP, while the South's will also jump by 17% compared to before unification. The country is estimated to become one of the larger economies in the world.
A unified Korea would be a country of 70 or 80 million people. that would make it the size of a Germany or a Japan. Korea today is a very important player on the global stage. I think a united Korea, given the size and the growth rates we'll see, and a unified Korea will be a very important player in East Asia, but also in the world more broadly.
Unification can create a shared market in Northeast Asia or the Asia Pacific, so a unified Korea will be beneficial in that sense.
It's not only a change in economic status, but a shift in political and diplomatic stature as well. Having been divided against the country's will in the midst of bigger political powers, it's important what stance a unified Korea takes. First, there's the question of how it will define relations with some of its conventional allies.
In geopolitical terms, it's called a sort of buffer zone, right? And so Korea should be peaceful, independent, and maybe strong, so that power struggle by external countries will not be repeated on the Korean Peninsula. I think that is very important.
Over the long run, a unified Korea will be a very powerful force in Northeast Asia, which will have its own independent foreign policy, and hopefully on good terms with all of the four major powers around it.
A unified Korea has the possibility of bringing big changes and becoming a central player in international politics within Northeast Asia.
In the face of sudden unification, Germany went through many difficulties and still has challenges that are unresolved. But over 25 years, it has successfully achieved integration and put its roots down in the European Union as a key player with greater economic power and leadership. There is something the two Koreas can learn from this. It's that with unification, the South and North, as well as neighboring countries, will find stability and further develop in the future. And this rosy outlook can only become reality with solid planning and preparations made ahead of unification.
It would be the best to forget a little bit of ideology and to think about that we have only one life, and everybody has only one life, and he should have the opportunity to decide himself or herself about the life they want to live.
I think the process of unification has already started. It comes with people-to-people engagement, information flowing, trade and commerce, and it hopefully will happen sooner rather than later.
It will be a very important actor in its own right in the Northeast Asian region and in the world, and I think that Koreans should be preparing now on what Korea's place in the world should be when the peninsula is unified.
Regarding Korea's unification, we had the chance to sit down with scholars from 4 neighboring countries. There were multiple opinions on when, how, and what effect Korea's unification will have. But there was one underlying belief. It's that Korea's unification is something that is essential, not just for the Koreas, but also for surrounding countries, and that it needs to be realized in the near future through peaceful means. The fact that there's a broader consensus on this conclusion may indicate that paving the road towards unification is already underway.